Business Insider created a video called Life Lessons from Centenarians, in which they featured the advice, the wisdom, and experience of several people who were living, and by all appearances, thriving, as they embarked on the second century of their lives. There was one line in particular that really stood out to me by a guy named Jack. And he said simply and powerfully, quote, "My attitude is I don't let the old man in. If I think old, I'm going to act old." End quote. Well said, Jack, and well worth a watch if you have 15 minutes. And I should also mention, Jack walks unassisted. He advises and he practices an hour of exercise each day. And he's over 100 years old. Something to think about, especially when I hear people in their 30s and 40s complaining about feeling old. How much of that feeling is just the result of letting the old man in? With that, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Unconditional with Norbie. Exciting episode today as we are talking longevity. Always an interesting subject, always an interesting topic, but a timely one as well, as I celebrated a birthday last week. I am now officially 42 years old, or 10 and a half leap years, as you may not know this, but I'm a leap year baby. Okay? February 29th, my actual birthday. Had a great birthday with the most important people in my life, and I am beyond grateful for where I'm at in life. Family, friends, purpose, sure. So much to be grateful for. I mean, honestly, I am feeling very, very fortunate. But also from a health and from a fitness perspective. And I can honestly say that this is the best that I have ever felt in my entire life. So given that, and given that birthday, and given the passing of another year, I wanted to reflect on and organize and just, share some of my thoughts on this idea of health span, of longevity, and share some of what I've been doing and what I am doing to bring about my best self for however long I have on this planet. If you've been with me before, welcome back. Great to have you again. And if you are new to the channel, it's great to have you as well on this adventure that is this young podcast. Okay, I've been fascinated by all things health and fitness for as long as I can remember. But like many, I can't help but notice that despite access to the most advanced healthcare and medicine the world has ever known, despite access to more gyms, more information on nutrition, on workout programs, and personal trainers and fitness influencers, we as a society have become fatter, sicker, and less mentally resilient. When 70% of the country is obese or overweight, something is off. When over half the country is dealing with 2 or more chronic conditions, something is off. When 29 million Americans are taking a prescription medication for depression, something is off. What is the explanation for all of this? What is the answer for all of this? I'd be lying to you if I told you that I had all of the answers. But I will tell you this, that trying to understand all of this, trying to unpack it, and reclaim the radical health and fitness that I believe, and so many of us believe, is our birthright, that is the goal of this podcast. One conversation at a time. So if any of that sounds like something that you want to be a part of, I assure you, you are in the right place. So today we're talking longevity, a fitting topic after a birthday, of course. We've had a few episodes on, I guess you could call training, more from an aesthetic standpoint, right? We've talked about looks maxing. We've talked about getting ripped. We've talked about losing weight naturally. No surprise, but I am squarely in the natural camp. Okay, I find the rise of the pharmaceutical-induced fitness to be very disturbing, a subject that we're going to continue to talk about more in depth in future episodes. But that's certainly not the only aspect of training, right? The aesthetic side, the performance side. It's important for sure. But there's this other aspect of improving one's health span and longevity as a key objective in my mind, and more recently as an approach and a conscious approach in my training. I'll say this, it's become increasingly obvious to me, especially when you start considering the rise of pharmaceuticals and PEDs by larger numbers of younger people, we actually may be entering an inflection point. where it's no longer obvious that working out or getting in shape has anything to do with health or longevity. In fact, in many cases, it might be the opposite. This topic is also timely because of one of the key figures, and I guess what you could describe as the longevity movement, and that's Dr. Peter Attia. Peter Attia has been around for a while, but he's recently come under fire and has been in the news, not for reasons related to health or fitness or his views on nutrition, but because of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Dr. Peter Attia is a guy I've mentioned before on this podcast, and he has influenced my thinking, and I think it's fair to say the thinking of many people, on how to approach the subject of aging and longevity, as well as what I believe is his greatest contribution in this conversation on anti-aging and on longevity, right? And thinking of this subject about aging. But obviously, we can't talk about Dr. Peter Attia in this day and age without touching on what's come out in the Epstein files. And essentially, for those who haven't followed this closely, some of Peter Attia's personal emails and I believe text exchanges with Epstein were released, in which Peter Attia makes some pretty derogatory comments about women's body parts. Okay, we'll just say that. Now, you might be willing to say, if you've read any of this or if you've been exposed to any of this, okay, not great. Maybe it's a joke that's in bad taste. Maybe you're willing to give the guy the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he had no idea that Epstein was involved in any kind of shadiness involving minors. But unfortunately for Peter Attia, that's not the case. Okay, Peter Attia became connected with Epstein in something like 2018. Okay, this is well after Jeffrey Epstein pled guilty to solicitation of prostitution and solicitation of a minor for prostitution in 2008. Okay, so just to be very clear, at this point in time, when Dr. Peter Attia gets connected with Jeffrey Epstein, this is after he had already been convicted and is a registered sex offender. Okay, so we have to point that out, okay? Now, Attia has addressed this by saying, quote, "Shortly after we met, I asked him directly about his 2008 conviction. He characterized it as prostitution-related charges. He only realized later that the description in 2018 was, quote, grossly minimized." Okay, maybe, maybe not. But since these files have been released, and the shock and the outrage stemming from the comments around Epstein, Attia has also issued a public statement and an apology, essentially explaining, at least from his perspective, his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, and that he never participated in nor witnessed any inappropriate behavior with underage girls with respect to Epstein. It's possible that everything Peter Attia is saying is true, but it is also very true that given his name occurs in the Epstein files more than 1,700 times, and that this is only a portion of the total files that have been released, this either represents an almost unbelievable level of naivete and poor judgment on the part of Dr. Peter Attia, or something else, maybe something much, much worse. And at least for now, the internet isn't willing to move on, and maybe rightfully so. In light of the even small amount that we know about Jeffrey Epstein at this point, it's hard not to feel a bit creeped out by a guy who wrote that he, quote, goes into Jeffrey Epstein withdrawal when he doesn't get to see him, or something to that effect. Okay, but it's also more than that. It's because of this release of this tranche, at least, of the Epstein files that enabled internet sleuths to match up a very specific, very notable, and I think we could say traumatic event in Dr. Peter Attia's life and in his family's life, something that came out as a result of the release of these Epstein files. And I'm going to quote directly here from an article in the New York Post, but there are many people who have pointed this out. But the Post says, quote, "In his book Outlive, The Science of Art and Longevity, Attia, 52, recounted the harrowing moment he received a call from his wife Jill, telling him that his son, Artin, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, had suddenly stopped breathing on the evening of July 11th, 2017. Attia says, quote, "I stayed in New York busy with my, quote, important work," he admitted in the book. Artin's cardiac arrest happened on a Tuesday, but I did not come home to San Diego until Friday of the following week, 10 days later, end quote. The article goes on to say, what Attia failed to mention, however, was during that harrowing time, he was making plans to meet up with Epstein, the disgraced New York City financier who was already embroiled at that time with allegations of trafficking minors, according to the newly released emails between the two. Okay, so there's a lot that could be said about this. But regardless of Epstein, regardless of the trafficking of minors, regardless of any of these things, I think you would be hard-pressed to find a person to say that this is admirable behavior in light of what's come out with respect to the Epstein files. I mean, it's really, really hard to wrap your head around it. Now, again, Attia has expressed regret over it. He's expressed the fact that he's ashamed, that he's regretted it. And certainly the guy has paid some prices. Attia has stepped down from his position with CBS. He's lost many of his sponsors. I think you could say it's definitely a fall from grace for a guy who was at the time maybe the leading voice within the longevity space. Now, this is a show about health and fitness, so we're going to shift the conversation back to longevity and about a specific concept that I first heard communicated by Dr. Peter Attia. But of course, to discuss Peter Attia at this point without commenting on his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, I just feel would also be inappropriate, right? Is he a creep? Kind of looks like it. Worse, maybe. But is it possible that he's made an important contribution in the longevity space and having all those things be true? Yeah, I think so. Right? I think it's possible that two things can be true at the same time. And my assertion is that that's the case here. Now, what's the specific idea? Okay, it's this idea that Peter Attia refers to as the marginal decade. And I really think this is, at least in my opinion, the most important contribution that Peter Attia has made to this conversation on longevity and of health span and all that. And why, even with all the shadiness to come out with the Epstein files, this is still very much an idea that is worth drilling into. Okay, definitely would be throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we disregard this just because of the source. So for those who are unfamiliar with this idea of the marginal decade, let me just summarize it briefly. And that is the idea that every single one of us, whether we realize it consciously or not, will, at some point in our lives, enter into what Peter Attia refers to as the marginal decade. And in this case, marginal meaning last. Okay, it's a term borrowed from economics. So this is the last decade of our lives. And critically, according to Attia, most of us will not know when we've entered into the last decade of our lives, into the marginal decade. But at some point when we're in the last decade of our lives, it will become clear that it has arrived. Now, all of that in and of itself is a bit sobering, right? Thinking about the end or thinking about death can be a bit sobering for people. But it gets worse. The other thing about the marginal decade, according to Attia, is that for most people, the reality of what they assume the marginal decade will look like, the kinds of things that they'll be doing, how they'll feel, how they'll move, is going to be dramatically different than what they have in their mind, right? The gap between reality and what is desired, what they have in their mind, is going to be very, very wide. And this is unfortunate. If you're to take people in their 40s and 50s and ask them, what are the kinds of things that they expect to be doing, maybe in their 70s, 80s, 90s, I think in most cases, you'd get a fairly long and fairly active list of the kinds of things that people expect to be doing, likely much, much more of the things that they love. They might be expecting to play golf or garden or play pickleball, right? Ride horses in my case, do mixed martial arts, whatever it is, right? Or just something even less high impact, like spending time with the grandkids, being able to pick them up, sit down on the floor, get up unassisted, right? All things that I think many people in their 40s and 50s sort of take for granted that they'll be able to do when they have the time, right? When they have the time and they have the money and they can relax and they don't have to focus so much on work. But if you were to take those same people in their 40s and 50s and sort of put them on a trajectory of how likely it is that they will actually be able to do any of those things based on their overall fitness, their overall body health, their mobility, their metabolic function in their 40s and 50s. The odds that they will be able to do any of these things in their 70s and 80s, whenever that marginal decade happens, it's almost zero. Sadly, there is an almost 0% chance that they will be doing any of those things in the last decade of their lives, because they are barely fit enough to do those things now. So the odds that they will magically transform their health, their fitness, their mobility in the next 20, 30 years without a serious intervention, it's essentially nil. Now that, of course, is the bad news. The good news is that what Attia points out is that this isn't inevitable, that armed with this knowledge, people can and should train specifically for the marginal decade, for the last decade of their lives, so that they can do and enjoy the kinds of things that they would like to do. And right now they expect to be able to do in the last decade of their lives, whatever it is, whenever that is, right? Maybe in their 70s, 80s, or beyond. So to me, this idea from Peter Attia, whatever his association with Epstein, is really, really worth thinking about, okay? I'm not sure that he's right about things like cholesterol. I'm not convinced about some of his ideas regarding the importance of VO2 max. But this frame, this idea, when it comes to longevity, and that the marginal decade is coming, and that it's something that we should prepare specifically for, that we should train for, this is an idea that has really influenced my thinking on health and fitness, especially for those of us that are in their 30s, 40s, and beyond. Hell, even if you're in your 20s, there's nothing wrong with considering and thinking about those things now. But certainly if you're in your 40s or 50s and you start mapping out, hey, if I've got knee pain from playing basketball now and in my 40s, what are the odds that I'm going to be able to play basketball, maybe a game you really love, in your 50s, 60s, 70s? Again, the odds are pretty darn low, right? Maybe nil. The good news is it's not too late. The good news is that even if you are getting close to your marginal decade, improvements still can be made. And we're going to talk about them. Now, as I said, I really like this idea. I really like this framework. Attia has his own practical recommendations about how he approaches this concept, right? This preparation, this training for the marginal decade. It includes things like VO2 max, which he's famously said is the greatest predictor of longevity. Honestly, I'm not so sure about that. We might even go in depth on this subject in the future, but there have been a number of very compelling things that I've seen that suggest that the data behind his claim, behind this claim, is not what Attia makes it out to be. Right? He emphasizes other things like grip strength, which, sure, I can see the argument there. But to me, these specifics aren't the important thing. The important thing is the approach and the mindset. Like, that's far more important than any of his specific recommendations. And I will share what this has translated to into my own head, right? Sort of how I'm approaching this idea and this framework, and started matching this concept up with the experiences of people I know who are older. And what ultimately this came down to for me is that I started to realize that there are 4 areas of the body, right? In my head, I sort of think of them as like the 4 horsemen of the aging apocalypse. These are 4 areas of the body that most likely are the areas that are going to break down. These are the areas that tend to go as people age, and more so than anything, at least as far as I've seen in my own experience and the people I know who have gotten older, and even frankly, some people that I've seen online, right? It's these 4 areas that go. One or more of either knees, hips, back, shoulders. Okay? Knees, hips, back, shoulders. Those, in my opinion, are the 4 horsemen of the aging apocalypse. One of these systems or multiple systems. And most people, as they get older, it's going to be one of these. It's going to be one of these that prevents them and precludes them from being able to do the sorts of things that they expect to be able to do and would like to be able to do in that marginal decade? Are things like physical strength and grip strength and VO2 max, endurance, are they important? Yeah, sure. I'm sure they're important, but it's very difficult to do anything that you would want to be able to do, including just live pain-free and have a fairly decent quality of life and independence, if one of these four systems is significantly deteriorated. So given that we know that, or at least that's my position, I have started to evolve my thinking to say, how can I improve each of these systems? How can I bulletproof each of these systems? How can I optimize these four systems so that they don't go out on me, so that they serve me and my activities and my interests and my family as long as humanly possible? Ideally, as long as I'm alive, right? Well into my marginal decade. Do I think that's possible? I absolutely do. Okay, I absolutely think that's possible. I don't think that this idea of just sort of slowly, kind of death mark like decline, just like warning lights going off in the body, and you just sort of smash the ignore button, continuing to fill it up with coffee and grit and determination. Yeah, I just don't think that model, that framework is helpful. And I think it's incomplete. I would even go as far as to say that I think it's maybe unnatural, maybe wrong. And forget Peter Attia, forget me for a second, or anything that you've been told or you've heard about from a health and a longevity, or an anti-aging perspective for just a second. And consider the people that you know in your own life, your grandparents, maybe your parents, or older people that you know. How many of these systems, of these four systems, played a role in the decline as they got older? And I would be willing to bet that at least one, or maybe even more than one, but definitely one, just my strong, informed hunch, played a role in the decline. So let's move beyond the theoretical and let's get to the practical. As you know, a key theme of this show, maybe the guiding principle, if you will, is that human beings are not built broken, but that many choices within the modern world are breaking us down. That this decline, that this lack of vitality, it might be common, but it sure as hell isn't normal. My aim is to reclaim the radical health and fitness that is our birthright, that is my birthright, yours as well, including my marginal decade, whenever that is. I'm not ashamed to say it. That's what I'm going for. Okay, I expect to be fully vibrant, fully healthy, fully vital, no exceptions. And I'm not satisfied with anything less than that. Okay, that's what I'm going for. I have no plans to go quietly into the night. So let's get into it. Let's start from the bottom and we're going to move our way up. Let's first talk about knees. And obviously in this day and age, you cannot talk about knee health without talking about knees over toes guy, okay? Ben Patrick. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that knees over toes guy, that's what he goes by on social media, YouTube, that sort of thing. But Ben Patrick is the most important name when it comes to the subject of optimizing and improving the health and function of your knees. If there was one thing to take away from this conversation and discussion on knees, it's to take down the name Knees Over Toes Guy, okay, or Ben Patrick. He has done a tremendous service, in my humble opinion, to humanity. Just doing incredible work, putting in the time, these personal experiments, challenging the status quo, rethinking what the conventional wisdom is, and working in a very unconventional way to see if he can improve the health span and the longevity and the performance of his knees. Okay, the short story of Ben Patrick, and I've said this before, but isn't it incredible how often the personal drives the professional, right? We talked about this way back in our conversation, like episode number 1, number 2, number 3, on the work of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis and the work of Dr. Weston A. Price. How so often within the health and fitness space, we like to think about innovation, we like to think about scientific advances as being objective, as being sort of like based on the research, or we just look dispassionately at what the data show, and then we decide from there how we should interpret the results. And I'm not saying that that doesn't happen sometimes, But I'm often struck by how often the personal, including personal tragedy, drives the professional. Right? And as I said with Dr. Weston A. Price, that tragedy is ultimately, in many cases, what leads to triumph, into these crazy breakthroughs. In the story of Knees Over Toes guy, Ben Patrick has a lot of the same elements. The short story here is that Ben Patrick, he was a guy that had chronic knee pain for his whole life. I think in high school, he had undergone multiple knee surgeries on both of his knees. He was told that he likely would never be able to run again, much less play basketball, right, which is the game that he loved. And I think Ben Patrick, I don't want to speak out of turn here, I think he's only like 6 foot, maybe 6'1". And in the book, I'm drawing a blank on what his book is called. I think it's called Knee Ability Zero. I don't know. I have the book. I've read it a long time ago, but don't quote me on the name here. But I think in the book, he points out that he could not touch the rim, right? So in basketball, jump up trying to touch the rim. And if I'm just kind of rough swagging it, I'm thinking at 6 foot, decent wingspan, he's probably got like a 20 to a 24-inch vertical, right? This is not very high, okay? And then this is a guy who goes on through his own self-study, his own just discipline and experimentation with his own body and exercises that are wild compared to what the conventional wisdom is, to not only run, not only to be able to sprint, but to go on to play basketball, right? To live pain-free, but then also to go on to add a massive amount of power and explosiveness to his knees, to his legs, to be able to dunk a basketball with ease. Right? I think he's developed something like over a 40-inch vertical. Okay. And as somebody who grew up playing basketball, that transformation is completely insane. Okay. It's just completely insane. It's like going from what I think it's probably fair to say would be the least athletic guy on your average low-level high school team to a level of athleticism that puts you right up there with the best jumpers in the NBA. Okay. I mean, it's just bonkers. Okay. Absolutely bonkers, this transformation. And he did it by himself, and he did it at an older age, right? He was, I think, in college when he really started doing this. And importantly, he did it by doing the exact opposite of what the experts said he should do. Again, isn't it interesting how often that is the case? Now, to be fair, Knees Over Toes guy, Ben Patrick, right? He's clear about the fact that he was building on the work and was influenced by the work of people. I think the pronunciation is Charles Poliquin, but he's a Canadian powerlifting coach that I think he was the one who figured out that the only time that your knee will start to lay down the necessary recovery fluid in order to start to recover and repair itself. Okay, I'm not talking about the muscles around the knee here. I'm talking about tendons and ligaments, the things that we're told are very difficult, if not impossible, to rehab without surgery. But the only time that the knee does that is when the knee is over the toe. Now, if you're to go online and you're to search something like Knees Over Toes guy, which I highly recommend, or Ben Patrick, you will likely see Ben in what he refers to as an ATG split squat. Okay, ATG is the name of his company, stands for, I think, ass to grass. Now, if you've never seen this before, it looks totally crazy. And if you're coming from the perspective, which I was, that the idea that the knee going over your toe is going to set you up for creating injury, it's going to deteriorate your knee, it's one of the worst things you could possibly do for your knee. If you're coming from that perspective, as many people are, seeing Ben Patrick in this ATG split squat in probably the fullest expression of the most difficult movement that's part of this program, it's just totally wild, right? It's essentially this very low lunge in which the back leg is almost all the way to the ground, right? The knee just barely off the ground. Hips are so low on the front leg in this lunge position that the butt is basically, or literally, touching the heel on the front leg, right? And the knee on the front leg is way out, right? I mean, the back of your hamstring, I should say, is basically resting on your calf. That's how far out the knee is. It's this crazy, long, low lunge. Now, obviously, that's not the starting point for knees over toes, right? If you were to show anybody who had any kind of knee pain, one of those photos, right? A photo of Ben Patrick doing a low lunge and then eventually doing this low lunge with weight, right? Under load. They're just like, no freaking way, right? I'm just going to completely blow out my knee. But there are many movements that build to this point, right? One of the most basic ways to start to get into that position of having your knee over your toe and to add load would be to simply walk backwards, right? So if you think about it, when you walk backwards, your knee naturally goes over your toe. And this is a very basic, but very effective way to strengthen the ligaments, the tendons, all of the stabilizer muscles that are involved in making the knee as robust and as healthy as possible. So if I were going to start thinking about the subject of bulletproofing the knee and thinking about this idea of making the knee and the knees as robust and as healthy for as long as I possibly can in the most efficient way, I am looking at Ben Patrick and I'm considering knees over toes. Highly, highly, highly recommend. So based on Ben Patrick's influence and based on gradually building up, I use these ATG split squats, right? This movement, this very low lunge that I described. I use them regularly, multiple times per week as part of my workouts. And I will say that it has done wonders for my knees. For anybody who's trained in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the past, as I have, or any kind of grappling sport, okay, you know that your knees can take a beating. Trying to prevent takedowns, twisting it in awkward angles. And knees over toes guy, Ben Patrick, his work, not surprisingly, within the jiu-jitsu community has been very popular for a very long time, right? Because it's very effective at rehabbing, strengthening, preventing injury to the knee. A couple years ago, I started to notice that my knees would get a little bit creaky, a little bit cracky, didn't want to move in particular ways. But since I added many of the things from knees over toes into my overall program, my knees have gotten better and better and better. As in literally never any problems. Okay. And that's what you want. You know something's working well when you don't have to think about it. One testament of this, one related movement, again, not a place to start, but this is a reflection of overall knee strength and what is possible with the right patient and deliberate work to develop this strength, to develop the stability and mobility, not only of the knees, but also of quad strength and of the psoas muscle. We'll talk about the psoas muscle here in a little bit, but it's the reverse Nordic curl. Now, if you're unfamiliar with this movement, again, just look it up. And for most people, especially those who have knee pain, I mean, it just looks like all kinds of raw, right? Like everything is just going to, explode. But to give you the visual, start on your knees and you're in this kneeling position. You're rigid, basically from the knee up to your head. And from there, using the muscles of your quad, your core, your knees, obviously, the stabilizers are in and around your knees, even like your tibialis muscle, the muscle that's in the front of your shin. You're going to lever back, right? So going all the way back, bringing your shoulders back towards the mat, back towards the ground. And then from there, you're going to work yourself again, using those same muscles, slow descent down, and then a slow movement going back up while keeping that area of your body, right? Everything from your knees up, completely flat, completely in a line, right? This is a phenomenal movement, especially if it's done correctly, especially if you build up gradually over time, which I have done. And it is I think, a very good reflection of the overall strength and stability of the knee, but also it's got this incredible stretch for the psoas muscle, which we'll discuss. So again, if I'm starting with knees and I'm thinking about how to bulletproof the knee as a system and thinking about the marginal decade, Ben Patrick, knees over toes guy, that's where I start. Okay, so that covers the knees. Next on our list, we've got hips. And anytime I think of hips, I think of that, what is it, Happy Gilmore? It's all in the hips. It's a Adam Sandler movie. That's what I think about. So we're talking about hips. And of course, I should say with all these, they're interrelated, right? It's very unlikely that somebody who's going to have, I don't know, say like tremendous pain in their back, but they're not going to have or develop issues or pain in their hips or their knees. It's just very unlikely. Okay. So even though we're talking about these in terms of 4 different systems, we of course should think about them as interrelated. And many of the movements that I like, maybe they primarily benefit one system, like the hips, but they also benefit the other systems, okay? Or even all 4, as we'll discuss with Turkish get-ups. Okay, so when it comes to hips, hips are one of the reasons that I love kettlebell training, okay? Lots of options here. But even if you think about just the basic two-handed kettlebell swing, I described this movement before, so I'm not going to do it again in the interest of time. But it's hard to think of any other movement that's quite as good as the two-handed kettlebell swing for developing explosive power, mobility, and endurance as the basic two-handed kettlebell swing. Add in glute bridges, and the 2 of those movements make a very, very powerful combination for the hips. Not the muscle system that most of us think about when we think about these movements, but one of the reasons that I really, really like these 2. Incredibly beneficial for the back as well, I should point out. And these 2 movements, kettlebell swings and glute bridges, they've become sort of my go-to when it comes to developing the strength, building the strength, the endurance, the power, the explosiveness, all that. Just the integrity of the hips. I think these 2 exercises are a phenomenal place to start. Now, we talked a little bit about the psoas muscle, and the psoas muscle, it's spelled P-S-O-A-S. The psoas muscle, if you're unfamiliar, is a muscle system that goes from the front of your hip, deep sort of within your pelvis, all the way to your back, to the back of your back. And you've got 2 of them, right? You've got one on the left side, one on the right side. And it's a very unusual muscle. Okay, it's very deep. It's notoriously difficult to stretch. And if you have any problems in your psoas, it can present pain in a number of places without the body, right? And sometimes moving, right? Sometimes you might feel it in your hip, and then other times you might feel it in your back. These different presentations are oftentimes the result of an inflamed or an overly tight or overly weak psoas. I think it's probably safe to say that the greatest enemy of this important muscle, the psoas muscle, is sitting. Okay, so when you think about sitting, which many of us do for 8, 10, maybe even longer hours per day, the psoas muscle, when you sit, is getting tighter, tighter, and tighter. Combine that over decades, and for most people, whether they know it or not, this is at the core of the pain that they experience in their hip, they experience in the back, right? And it was, in my case. The most effective thing that I've seen for this muscle would be one of 2 things. We talked about reverse Nordics, right? Very difficult movement for most people. Certainly not the place to start for most people, but it does provide an incredible stretch and the incredible ability to target, to condition, to build, and to strengthen this muscle, okay? And build utility in this incredibly powerful, deep muscle, okay? But obviously, a reverse Nordic is going to be very difficult for most people to start. If you do start, you can obviously start assisted with something like a bands. But the other movement that's incredibly important and very, very helpful in alleviating any of the tightness in the psoas muscle, which may be, again, presenting as pain in the hip or presenting as pain in the back, is what's referred to as the couch stretch. Okay. Now, you could do this up against the couch, as the name suggests, or you could do this up against the wall. And if you have any kind of pain in your hips or back, I implore you, okay, as hard as I possibly can, with as much, just love and goodwill for what you can achieve in terms of your athletic potential, to check out the couch stretch. Hey, but I'll try to describe it here. It's a similar position to like a classic lunge stretch where you've got one knee on the floor, okay, with the back knee on the floor. But rather than the shin of that back leg lying flat on the ground, it's actually up. Okay, so that shin bone is going to be up, perpendicular, or at least as close as you can to perpendicular to the floor. Now, where's the shin going to be pushed up against? Well, it's going to be pushed up against the couch, or it's going to be pushed up against the wall. Okay, that's where the name couch stretch comes into. Now, when you first start, depending on how tight you are, you're probably going to feel this as a quad stretch. And you're saying, okay, this is just a quad stretch. What's the difference between me just standing there and sort of pulling my shin to my butt? But with time, with this particular variation, this couch stretch, you will eventually start to feel it in your hip. And then even more so over time, you'll start to feel it deep within like your low abdominals. Okay. That's where the psoas starts to tie in as well. Okay. So it's a very, very deep, very powerful stretch. And given that we all sit, I couldn't recommend this stretch highly enough. Now, one other idea that I'd like to introduce to this conversation, and this is as good a place to do it as any, is this idea of strength at length. Okay, strength at length. And if you just think about for a second, when most injuries occur, at least it seems to me, that when most injuries occur is when the body, or particular muscle system or joint or whatever it is stressed at an odd angle, or when the body is stressed at the maximum point of strength and mobility, right? So whatever the maximum point is that you can stretch or that your muscles go to at length is typically where that injury occurs, right? Think about a sprained ankle. It's not when your foot is flat or slightly rolled when you're walking, but it happens wherever that maximum range is, right? You go a little past it and pop, that ankle goes. So my goal, one goal, is to extend the maximum range and the strength at that maximum range for athletic performance, of course, but also for injury prevention. Now, this is obviously a process that has to be done very, very slowly here. Okay. I'm talking about measuring success over years, not over, days or weeks. Okay. If we are going to work at the longest position, at the maximum stretch that our muscles can go, we've got to be very, very careful. I can't just take maximum load and get to maximum length and expect we're going to have a good outcome. Okay, so that's knees, hips. We've talked about strength at length, just kind of another way that I think about this subject. Let's move on to talk about the back. And there is one name that I'd also like to recommend here, who is, I think, the guy when it comes to the back. And that name is Dr. Stuart McGill. If you're not familiar with the work of Dr. Stuart McGill, as I said, I think he's widely considered to be the guy when it comes to the back. And in my own humble assessment, based on what I've seen, I think that's for good reason. One of his key insights, one of the things that confuses many people about the back is that pain in the back often originates either from the front of the spine or the back of the spine. Okay, so even though that it's maybe difficult to feel exactly where it's coming from, you don't know necessarily just based on the pain, the location of the compression of the back has major implications for whether the exercises you are doing, what you're trying to do to alleviate the pain, is going to make things better or make them worse. Okay, one analogy that I've heard from, I think, Dr. Andrew Huberman, he was talking with Stuart McGill, or at least referencing his work, is to think about the spine as an Oreo cookie. Right? So the vertebrae, like the bones of the spine, are kind of like that chocolate cookie part. Right? And the spinal discs, the fluid, the filled cushions between the bones, those are like the frosting in the middle. Okay, now if you imagine an Oreo cookie being compressed to one side or the other, the pressure can shift towards the front of the spine, right? Think towards your belly button, or towards the back of the spine, right? Towards, I guess your back, right? And when one side compresses, the vertebrae press onto that disc, right? And that's where they cause compression, and that's where the pain originates from. Now, again, the pain, just because it's originating from that point in the body, doesn't mean that you're gonna necessarily be able to feel the difference, whether the compression is happening in the front or in the back. Okay, so if I can't feel the difference, then why does it matter? Well, why it matters is because if your pain is coming from compression in the front of the spine towards the belly button, doing exercise that create more compression on that side of the spine, exercises that we've all been told might help back pain, right? Developing your core, working up your core muscles. So we logically think of things like sit-ups or crunches. They may actually make the pain worse, even though these are exercises that are often recommended for back pain. In this case, movements that relieve the compression here, such as Cobra Pros, right? Think of the opposite of what a crunch would look like, may actually help by slightly opening up the front of that spine and relieving the pressure. The flip side of this is that if the compression is coming on the back side of the spine, those same movements, the Cobra pose, right, that may actually, again, cause additional pain. And other types of movements, such as sit-ups, Jefferson curls, right, kind of like this slow, weighted spinal rounding exercise. Think kind of like RDLs, but with a very round back, or poses like Happy Baby. They may provide relief by opening up that space in the back. So if you've been trying to relieve back pain with crunches or with sit-ups, as I did in the past, and it hadn't improved, or maybe it even made things worse, as it did in my case, it's possible that your pain originates from the opposite side of the spine. And so in that case, you benefit from exercises that relieve the compression to wherever that side is, right? And you'll know, right? Because you start doing some of these movements, you go to the crunches, you go to the sit-ups, you wake up and it feels worse. Okay, you've got to work the opposite side, right? You've got to provide flexion and bend to the opposite side. So understanding where the compression is occurring, whether front or back, can make a world of difference in choosing the movements that will help rather than hurt. Okay, so what does this mean for me very practically? Well, when I had back pain a couple years ago, I did evolve how I was targeting the back pain. So I stopped doing things like sit-ups and I started working on things like RDLs. I started working on things like Cobra pose in yoga. And that did relieve and alleviate the back pain, in addition to working on the psoas stretches that I talked about. Now, at this point in time, because I don't have any back pain, my focus is more on general back strengthening and abdominal strengthening to ensure that my back is as healthy as possible. And here I utilize things like straight leg deadlifts. Okay, I do these often. Obviously, things like kettlebell swings also massively benefit the back. Right? And again, we've talked about the linkages between the psoas muscle and the back. That was definitely a factor in my case. So even things like reverse Nordics, in a weird sort of roundabout way, they benefit the back. I've also started working on Jefferson curls. I described it briefly, but think of an RDL with a very pronounced curl in your back, right? Slowly sort of unlocking each vertebrae on the spine is the way that I think about it as you slowly descend. Something that has to be done very slowly, very gradually, very lightweight at the beginning, because this isn't a movement that most of us have ever trained. It's another good example of developing that strength at length. Okay, this Jefferson curls. Oh, and there's also one really, really important thing that I want to emphasize. Okay, I've realized I almost forgot it. If something is difficult now, whatever age you're at, 20s, 30s, 40s, doesn't matter. It will only become more difficult the longer you leave it the way it is. Right? If there is a nagging pain, if there's weakness, if there is any chink in your armor that makes up one of these four systems, solve it now. Just my 2 cents. Okay, so one last one to think about is your shoulders. For me, again, this is one of the reasons why kettlebells are such an effective training tool. Okay, I know they get a lot of hate, especially from the bodybuilding community, okay? But if you look at a competitive bodybuilder and say, I'd probably prefer to look a little different, I'd probably prefer to feel a little bit different, move a little bit different, okay, much, much more outside of that realm, including kettlebells. Yes, of course, kettlebells are great for aesthetic training. Yes, they are great for weight loss and fat loss, all the reasons I like kettlebell training. But another reason I love kettlebells is how effective they are at improving range of motion, mobility, strength, and the overall integrity of the shoulder. Movements like thrusters, clean and press, or clean and jerk are great for the shoulders. Obviously, if done correctly and if you're starting with an appropriate weight and building up, right, all that. And there is another movement that can be very, very good for the shoulders. And it did originate, from what I understand, from kettlebell training. Also good for your knees, hips, everything, right? All the four systems we talked about. And that is the Turkish get up. Okay, the easiest thing to do in this case is definitely look up Turkish get up. Okay, but it involves using one kettlebell starting from a lying down position on your back and then going through a series of movements, sort of slow, controlled, deliberate, that will get you all the way up to a standing position with the kettlebell above your head. Okay, not just simply trying to stand as quickly as you can and put the kettlebell over your head. Okay, there's a specific series of movements, and it's the type of movement that you really want to do correctly. It is a fantastic movement from my perspective, and I'm not alone on this. Okay, I've heard Joe Rogan talk about it. I've heard Pavel Tsatsouline, obviously, the kettlebell guy, talk about it. Just a great movement. Great for stabilizing and improving the shoulder. So if Turkish get-ups are unfamiliar, definitely check those out. And I will also say that Ben Patrick, knees over toes guy, he's got a very good series on bulletproofing the shoulders. Try to link to it in the show notes. And it might even be called Bulletproofing Your Shoulders or something to that effect. So from my perspective, certainly not, just sort of a one-trick pony when it comes to the knees. And I've utilized in the past when I've ever had shoulder pain, that video to help diagnose where the pain might be originating and what specific movement patterns might improve it. And again, if you have ever injured your shoulder, you know how connected the shoulder is to almost everything you do. Okay, both in the gym and in life. It's very difficult to do push movements, pull movements, curl movements, work with your legs if you have shoulder pain. Could be. And the same is true in life. Basic things like putting on a shirt, moving something into your car, they become difficult. You start to become dependent. Okay, all things that you want to think about with respect to your marginal decade. As you get older, you absolutely want integrity in your shoulders. You want to be able to do these things. You want independence, you want strength, you want power, you want quality of life when it comes to these last years that you have. And the important thing is to start building for them and training for them now, whatever it looks like, right? If it's playing golf, pickleball, riding horses, sitting on the floor, picking up your grandkids, whatever those things are, the idea that a small pain in the shoulder now is going to do anything other than deteriorate, is going to somehow magically improve in the absence of specific and dedicated work, it's a pipe dream. Okay, so we've talked about knees, we've talked about hips, we've talked about back, we've talked about shoulders. Okay, and of course, all of this within the context of the marginal decade. Okay, think deeply about this idea from Peter Attia. He might be wrong about a lot of things, okay, but I don't think he's wrong about this. I do believe that this is the correct frame and the correct mindset when it comes to training for longevity and incorporating longevity into your training, right? That might be a better way to say it. The way that I think about it is through these four systems. That's how I've started to incorporate my own longevity protocols, okay? Which of course, interrelated, knees, hips, back, and shoulders, okay? This is, I can guarantee you, where the issues are likely going to be. So make it a priority to bulletproof these systems and build the marginal decade of your dreams. I am not a subscriber to the idea that aging is just inevitable or that a slow decline into a state of being decrepit and unable to do anything for yourself is just part of life. There are just too many examples of people in their 80s and 90s who are still incredibly vital. There are people who even started their fitness journeys in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, and have had remarkable turnarounds. It is possible, okay? And with specific work, in my own case, I believe it's very, very likely. That's going to have to be it for me today. As always, thank you so much for the listen. If you are getting value from these conversations, please consider a like, subscribe, a share. Really helps out the show. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Thanks again, and I will see you again next week.